Hi, and welcome back to Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy, where today we will begin the Jeffersonian era from 1800 to 1825 with a look at Part 1 featuring Jeffersonian Republicanism, the Marbury Pirates, the Louisiana Purchase, the Embargo Acts, and more. In a previous lesson, we learned about the Constitutional Convention and the creation of a more powerful national government, as well as a political feud between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton that helped establish the roots of political parties in America, with the Federalist and Democratic Republican parties. We saw how these parties chose sides in the ongoing war between the British and French, which would continue to divide public opinion, and how the British practice of impressment was angering Americans towards the British, as well as French obstruction of U.S. mercantilism. Finally, we learned about how the presidency of John Adams and the passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts had caused many Americans to question their political perspectives. So, what do you need to know? Well, for most U.S. histories, you will need to understand the ideals and policies of Thomas Jefferson and our early presidents, and how their policies impacted the country and the standing of the United States in foreign affairs. Some major themes that we will look at over the course of our next two lessons are the ideals of what is known as Jeffersonian Republicanism, the causes and impact of the War of 1812, and the growing influence of the United States in global politics with the Monroe Doctrine. And just a reminder, teachers at this PowerPoint with a wide variety of resources are available at Teachers Pay Teachers. Just click the link in the notes below this video or search for Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy at Teachers Pay Teachers. So for today's lesson, you should understand what is known as the Revolution election of 1800, Jeffersonian Republicanism, Agrarianism, the Louisiana Purchase, strict constructionists, Marbury versus Madison, and Judicial Review, the Marbury Pirates, and the coming of the War of 1812. As we mentioned in our last video, there was a backlash towards President John Adams and the Federalist Party from the Alien and Sedition Acts, which targeted French and other immigrants and people speaking out against the government. In response, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison drafted what are called the Virginia and Kentucky Resolutions. In these documents, they argued that states should not have to follow laws they deemed unconstitutional. With this, Jefferson and Madison introduced the idea of what is called nullification. This meant that states could consider federal laws null and void if they felt they went against the Constitution. In other words, they could ignore these national laws. The South would use this argument later to fight laws against tariffs and slavery in the lead-up to the Civil War, which we'll look at later this year. The election of 1800 featured Federalist President John Adams running for re-election versus Democratic Republican Thomas Jefferson. The Federalists, again, wanted a strong central or national government. They wanted to promote manufacturing and were often seen as the party of the wealthy, and they practiced a loose interpretation of the Constitution. The Republicans wanted a weak national government, emphasizing farming and rule by the people, and a strict interpretation of the Constitution, and we'll explain what that means in a little bit. Elections were much different in those days. Candidates did not campaign for themselves. However, their supporters published newspaper articles and pamphlets to promote their candidates. During the election of 1800, slanders, lies, and personal attacks were launched at both candidates. Federalists painted the Republicans as French revolutionaries and Jefferson as, quote, godless. Republicans accused the Federalists of being in the pockets of the merchants and bankers. Much of the political rhetoric of the election of 1800 can be heard in our modern elections and the arguments put forward by the Democrats and the Republicans. The election of 1800 was an electoral mess. In those days, electors cast two votes. Republicans voted for Jefferson and their vice presidential candidate, a senator named Aaron Burr. When one of the electors forgot to throw out his vote for Burr, it resulted in a tie, sending the election to the House of Representatives to decide. Opponents of Jefferson initially voted for Burr. However, Alexander Hamilton helped throw the election to Jefferson. The bad blood between Hamilton and Burr would be settled later with pistols, but we'll look at that later. This election is sometimes known as the Revolution of 1800 because it demonstrated the peaceful transfer of political power, where different visions for government could change hands peacefully. The transfer is found in what is known as Jeffersonian Republicanism. The expression Jeffersonian Republicanism or Jeffersonian Democracy meant that the power should no longer be held by the wealthy aristocracy or elite, but by the people. Jefferson portrayed himself as a simple man. He was the first president who truly did live in the newly built White House, and he liked to dress in simple clothes, and he even walked to his inauguration, feeling that carriages somehow represented the upper class. Again, he didn't want to be seen as an aristocrat, even though he was. Jefferson's domestic goals were to shrink the size of the federal government, eliminate Hamilton's internal taxes, shrink the military, and build an economy around farming. Jefferson believed in what is known as Agrarianism. He thought that the simple, quote-unquote, yeoman farmer was the backbone of the country and a much better option than the manufacturing economies that European countries were building. In Jefferson's view, farmers were independent and less likely to be politically corrupted, as were factory workers and traders and merchants, who were more likely to be manipulated by their bosses and investors. And Jefferson mostly accomplished his goals. Halfway through his presidency, Jefferson had shrunk the national debt, drastically reduced taxes, and shrunk the size of the federal government and the military. However, Jefferson did have some constitutional issues, especially brought on by a Supreme Court case known as Marbury versus Madison. When Jefferson had been elected, John Adams and the Federalist-controlled Congress passed the Judiciary Act of 1801. Having lost the election to the Republicans, their goal was to stack the courts with Federalists who would serve for life. Adams spent his last hours in office filling out appointments for what became known as the Midnight Judges, one of whom was a man named William Marbury. The incoming administration found a stack of undelivered appointments, and Jefferson ordered his Secretary of State, James Madison, to not deliver them, and he didn't, including Marbury's. Marbury sued to the Supreme Court, where newly appointed Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall declared that Marbury probably should have been given his appointment, but that the Supreme Court shouldn't be hearing the case because part of the Judiciary Act of 1789 was unconstitutional. Marshall, a Federalist who happened to be Jefferson's cousin, the two strongly disliked each other, instituted this new power for the Supreme Court known as judicial review. And that's what you have to remember from Marbury versus Madison. This was the power to declare laws unconstitutional. This power, which had been missing from the Constitution, made the Supreme Court much more equal with the other two branches. Jefferson also had constitutional issues when it came to foreign affairs. For years, pirates along the northern coast of Africa had been raiding American merchant ships. Jefferson, who scrapped the Navy, was forced to build new ships. He wanted to destroy these pirates, but wasn't sure whether he had the constitutional power. He also had to rebuild ships to do so. The first Barbary Wars from 1801 to 1805 demonstrated that America could not completely neglect their military the way Jefferson wanted. Much of the fighting in the Barbary Wars took place in Tripoli, and in recent years this land, which is modern-day Libya, was controlled by a dictator Muammar Gaddafi, who was assassinated in 2011. And Libya was also the scene of the Benghazi terrorist attacks in which American ambassador Christopher Stevens was killed. The history of Northern Africa has long been a challenging one that you'll learn more about. Meanwhile, in Europe, the Napoleonic Wars were raging. In 1800, Napoleon of France took control of the Louisiana Territory in North America from Spain. After France's inability to stop the Haitian Revolution, Napoleon abandoned his North American ambitions and offered the land to Jefferson for $15 million in 1803. Jefferson, what we call, again, a strict constructionist, or a believer in the idea that the federal government should only do what the Constitution stated, worried that he didn't have the power to purchase the land. However, the chance to double the size of the United States by purchasing land spanning from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains proved too much for Jefferson to turn down. The massive amount of new land to be settled paved the way for future westward expansion in a movement that is known as Manifest Destiny. It also created new opportunities for Jefferson's beloved farmers. As the Louisiana Purchase was going through, Jefferson had sponsored an expedition to explore the western lands by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Their journey, known as the Lewis and Clark Expedition, was an exciting moment for early U.S. history. The Lewis and Clark Expedition encountered many different Native American tribes, some of whom helped, including a woman named Sacagawea. Sacagawea provided a lot of assistance in dealing with other tribes and surviving the western wilderness, and has become a historical figure. This expedition provided America with much greater knowledge of what lay to the west, as well as creating great excitement for the settlement of western United States, which we'll be covering again later this year. In the meantime, political tensions between Federalists and Republicans continued even around the Louisiana Purchase and other issues. Bad blood between Republican Vice President Aaron Burr and Federalist Alexander Hamilton led to a duel in which Burr killed Hamilton. This feud is one of America's infamous moments in our history, and as my students will tell you, is celebrated in the hit Broadway play Hamilton. In Jefferson's second term, tensions continued to rise between the United States, France, and England. Both European countries, again at war, continued to threaten American shipping, including impressment and the seizure of American ships. Again, impressment was the seizing of American sailors and forcing them to serve on British ships. The British claimed that they were looking for their own sailors who had deserted, but they would often take Americans. In response, Jefferson passed the Embargo Act of 1807, refusing to buy or sell goods to the British. Unfortunately, this mostly hurt American businessmen and farmers, and the French and British barely noticed the embargo. In addition, when the British encouraged more Native American attacks in the West, many more Americans would begin calling for war with the British. And that's where we'll pick up next time, in the lead up to the War of 1812. But before we do, let's review. What documents did Jefferson and Madison draft in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts, the ones that said states could ignore laws? The Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. What was the concept that these documents introduced in which states thought that they could ignore these federal laws? Nullification. Who won the electoral vote in the election of 1800? It was a tie between Jefferson and Burr. Because the election of 1800 transferred power to another political party, it is sometimes referred to as the Revolution of 1800. What does Jeffersonian Republicanism or democracy mean? It means that the people, not the aristocracy, should rule. What were Jefferson's domestic goals? Well, he wanted to shrink the size of the federal government, eliminate a lot of Hamilton's internal taxes, shrink the military, and he favored agrarianism. What Supreme Court case established judicial review? Marbury versus Madison. What is judicial review? The power to declare laws unconstitutional. What wars were fought against the North African pirates? The Barbary Wars. What revolution convinced Napoleon to sell the French North American holdings? The Haitian Revolution. What was the purchase of the massive amount of western lands from the French called? The Louisiana Purchase. What did the people who believe the government should only do what the Constitution says called? Strict constructionists. What was the name of the expedition Jefferson sponsored to explore the new western lands? The Lewis and Clark Expedition. What was the name of the Native American woman who helped this expedition? Sacagawea. What two famous political rivals fought a duel? Alexander Hamilton against Aaron Burr, the vice president. What were the British doing to American ships? Confiscating and impressing soldiers. What policy did Jefferson put in place to punish the British? The Embargo Act of 1807. And that's where we're going to pick up next time. I want to thank you guys for watching. Be sure to subscribe because we're going to look at the Jeffersonian era part 2 in our next video. And just a reminder, teachers, that this PowerPoint with worksheets, smartboard activities, quizzes, Kahoots, lesson plans, and additional activities are available at Teachers Pay Teachers. Just click the link in the notes below this video or search for Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy at Teachers Pay Teachers. Keep up that good work, guys, and you're going to ace your next exam.